The Canal age was gripping Britain. Moving goods and people by water, so sensible, so quiet, so smooth, so slow, but so cheap. During the late 18th century, nearly all the major towns in the country were connected to the expanding inland waterway network. But rather strangely, the nation's second biggest port, Bristol, could not be reached from London. A number of people, however, entrepreneurs, engineers and traders, dreamed and planned that it should be. Earlier, by 1725 in fact, the River Kennet from the River Thames at Reading was made navigable to Newbury, and the River Avon was made navigable from Bristol to the city of Bath. It wasn't until 70 years later, however, that, to the design of the engineer and architect John Rennie, the construction of the bit in the middle, the 55 miles from Newbury to Bath, was begun, and at last in 1810 the magnificent waterway called, not surprisingly, the Kennet and Avon Canal was completed. This coincided with the opening of the new Bristol docks, and so began a period of prosperity for water transport across southern England, which, sadly, lasted barely 30 years until the railways usurped the canal's role in the 1840s. The legacy of that period, however, is with us today. Here at the western extremity of the Kennet and Avon navigation is one of the most remarkable examples of the enterprise and boldness of the engineers of the Industrial Revolution, Bristol's floating harbour, as it is called. In order to provide a non-tidal dock to accommodate the growing trade of the prosperous city of Bristol, William Jessup cut a brand new course for the River Avon and built the massive docks and wharves you see today along the original river banks. The floating harbour was completed in 1809. The year before, as it happened, the Kennet and Avon Canal opened from Newbury to Bath to link Bristol and the west with the River Thames and London. Today, thanks to the foresight of the city fathers, Bristol city docks, although almost bereft of their original commercial use, the remaining trade being confined to slurry disposal boats and a coaster bringing in sand, have been saved and restored. The floating harbour gives the city a unique focal point and provides a magnificent setting for Brunel's amazing ship SS Great Britain, the first iron-hulled, propeller-driven steamship in the world, now resting in the actual dock where she was built. Also in the harbour is the Maritime Heritage Centre, the Industrial Museum, the National Lifeboat Museum, the Watershed Exhibition Centre and much else. The waterfront is a constantly changing spectacle of vessels, from historic, square-rigged sailing ships to modern craft as they come and go through the floating harbour. It is an unforgettable experience to sail a narrow boat from the canal and the River Avon into the floating harbour and suddenly find yourself amongst sea-going ships. You feel awfully small. Private boats, but not hire boats, can venture downstream onto the tidal River Avon and out onto the River Severn, turning right for Sharpness and the Midlands, and left for, well, America and the world. The entrance to and exit from the non-tidal floating harbour at the east is Netham Lock, where the original course of the River Avon is joined. At most states of the tide, this lock is open at both ends, but at exceptionally high tides, the river becomes higher than the dock's level, and then the lock gates are closed and it is navigated like a normal lock. The lock keepers here keep a very close eye on the river and boat traffic and are keen to advise on safety of navigation. In this wooded valley, still surprisingly close to the centre of Bristol, is the first proper lock on the River Avon, Hanham Lock, and the start of British Waterways jurisdiction of the navigation, which will continue all the way to the lock before the River Thames in Reading, 86.5 miles away. tiny hamlet of Hannam on the north bank of the river, above the lock, has two pubs, side by side, so thirsty boaters have a choice, or perhaps can sample both. The river, now properly rural, skirts the small town of Keynsham, but before it does so, passes the imposing and dominating Cadbury's chocolate factory. It must be remembered that the River Avon between Bristol and Bath has been navigable ever since its opening in 1727. It did not suffer the closure and dereliction as the canal from Bath eastwards did from 1952 to 1984. Consequently, pleasure cruising has long been established on the Avon, mostly by river or sea-going craft. Confusingly further away from Saltford village than Kelston Lock, the next one, Saltford Lock, has, right on the lock side, the Jolly Sailor, a deservedly popular inn, originally the miller's house to a leather mill. Below the lock stand the remains of one of the many brass mills, which were once very common along the river. The new popularity of the river as a leisure resource is evident at Kelston Lock, which curiously is actually in Saltford. On the site of an old established boat builder's, and just above the last to close brass mill, is a new marina with its pub and restaurant. Dominating the whole valley here stands the handsome Kelston Park, high on its hill on the north bank. Still owned by the Neal family, the house has for some time been used as a Methodist training centre. And so to Bath. The first inkling of the city's classical splendours is the entrance under the broad span of Newbridge. It is sobering to think that this bridge carried all London to Bristol and Wales traffic before the A4 was relieved by the M4. Here at Newbridge is also a new marina. The centre of Bath is reached after passing through one more lock at Weston. Almost unnoticed under a little bridge is the entrance to the Kennet and Avon Canal itself. But before we venture through it, we must go the final quarter of a mile of the River Avon to its head of navigation at Pulteney Weir. Above the weir stands the famous Pulteney Bridge, and the moorings here must be the most romantic this side of Venice. At night, the floodlit bridge, weir and abbey make the setting breathtakingly beautiful. But back to the canal entrance and goodbye to the River Avon. The first canal lock is hiding just inside the entrance bridge and is close to the Baptist church with the well-known and eye-catching texts on the roof. The next lock is actually two locks made into one. It was a road scheme that caused this to happen in the 1970s. The result is one of the deepest locks on the British canal system, a concrete chasm that, filled with water, raises boats nearly 19 feet from the pound below. The Whitcomb flight of 6 locks is acknowledged by many to be one of the finest urban lock flights in the country. As one climbs up through Deep Lock away from the main road, it is easy to agree with those who think so. Hiding away now behind houses and churches, beside gardens and allotments, the locks and their surroundings have an atmosphere of antiquity. The little iron footbridges were over 100 years old when their maker, the Bath firm of Stothard and Pitt, fitted their cranes to the deck of the Titanic. Emerging from the top lock, it is almost a surprise to find oneself above the city, looking down on the Abbey and across at the Georgian crescents on the hillside opposite. On the right side of the canal are old wharves and warehouses and the dominating shape of the Malt House, now converted imaginatively to offices. Soon after leaving Whitcomb Top Lock, the remains of Sydney Wharf is passed. Although few of the original buildings remain, this was once the main trading wharf of Bath, and large quantities of commodities such as Somerset coal and Bath stone were once traded to and from this wharf. Sydney Wharf is now moorings for private narrowboats and also the base of the charter restaurant boat named after the canal's builder, John Rennie. Although a large boat, the John Rennie is still not as big as the original broad beam barges that traded on the canal. Leaving the bustle of the city behind, the canal turns a wooded bend to reveal an extraordinary sight, the channel disappearing into a tunnel underneath a large Georgian house. This is Cleveland House. Built by the Duke of Cleveland, it became the headquarters of the Kennet and Avon Canal Company. If you look carefully up at the roof as you enter the tunnel, you can see a stone-shaped hole. This is a passage leading up into the cellar of the house, and it's reputed that the Canal Company management would drop down messages to boatmen passing underneath. Emerging from the tunnel, the canal is now, although barely half a mile from the city centre, in the secret world of Sydney Gardens. The proprietors of the fashionable pleasure gardens in the late 18th century did not take kindly to the prospect of what they saw as a dirty, noisy waterway cutting through their elegant gardens, so they insisted that the canal matched its surroundings. John Rennie succeeded supremely, the elegance of the canal even exceeding that of the pleasure gardens. This stretch of the canal is an example of the happy interaction between function and design, so often apparent in the early Industrial Revolution period. Imagine a motorway being built to the same specifications today. Beyond the second tunnel, the canal now is clearing the city and begins to enter a more open landscape, although the streets and houses are still visible across the valley and down below the canal. Just here is Darlington Wharf, from where the amazing passenger boat service ran to Bradford on Avon. Special boats designed in Scotland, hence called the Scotch boats, were pulled by teams of cantering horses and covered the 9 miles to Bradford on Avon in little more than an hour. In 1852, the canal was bought by Brunel's Great Western Railway, who owned it for nearly 100 years. Needless to say, under railway ownership, the Scotch boat passenger service was soon axed. Folly Bridge, which until recently was the first swing bridge to be met with, is at the site of the Folly Inn, a canal-side pub demolished rather unexpectedly in 1942 by a bomb. The village of Bathampton is really a suburb of Bath, but from the canal it presents a distinctly rural appearance, with its cottages, pub and pretty church. The George Inn is far older than the canal, and suffered the indignity of having the canal built right up against its erstwhile front door. Bathampton Church is known for its tomb of Admiral Phillips, the first governor of New South Wales, and so is a place of pilgrimage for many visiting Australians. Since leaving the river at Whitcomb, the canal has been travelling in a northerly or northeasterly direction, but now, beyond Bathampton, it rounds the corner of the hillside into the Limpley Stoke Valley, and turns through more than 180 degrees. In fact, for a short while we find ourselves facing southwest, back towards the sea again. At the entrance to the valley is the first of the many swing bridges which cross the canal. The last will not be met with until we are 6 miles from the River Thames. As the waterway, when it was built, cut through many properties, mostly farms, crossings had to be provided, both to preserve rights of way and to enable severed land to be rejoined, just like with today's motorways, and before them the railways. Rather than build expensive stone or brick bridges with full navigational headroom at every crossing, John Rennie chose to construct simple, low wooden bridges, which swung open at every crossing which was not a public road. Rotating on trays of cannonball-sized bearings, these bridges are, somewhat surprisingly, the earliest known use of the ball bearing in the world. One would somehow have imagined that the Chinese, or at least Leonardo da Vinci, would have invented this, but no, it was John Rennie, who incidentally was responsible for other innovations of the Industrial Revolution. Well into the Limpley Stoke Valley now, the canal clings firmly to its contour line. So determined was John Rennie to minimise locks that having lifted the canal to this level in Bath, he maintained it for 9 miles up the increasingly steep and narrow valley, as far as Bradford on Avon. Characteristic stone bridges carry roads and tracks over the channel, the oval arches unusually starting to return beyond the vertical before water level is reached. High above the village of Claverton, which itself is above the canal, stands Claverton Manor, a grand classical house built by Geoffrey Wyatville for the Vivian family in the early 19th century. Today it houses the American Museum, the first museum of American life outside the United States. Many feet below the towering Claverton Manor, right at the bottom of the valley, snuggles a very much more humble building, but whose interior contains delights even greater to some than the interesting American Museum. Even before the Kennet and Avon opened throughout in 1810, it became clear that water supply at the western end was inadequate, and John Rennie designed and built a pump on the site of an old grist mill to raise water the 47 feet from the River Avon. Powered by an enormous undershot water wheel, 2 vertical pistons pump the water through a large cast iron pipe up to the canal. The complex yet simple machinery is wonderful to behold as it slowly and powerfully turns and lifts 2.37 million gallons a day. Burning no fuel, using river flow to pump river water, Claverton Pump must be the ultimate green machine, and perhaps the nearest thing to perpetual motion man has produced. Restored and manned by volunteers of the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust, this unique machine is one of the marvels of the Industrial Revolution. And so to Dundas, a place with so much of interest that we mustn't tarry too long or we'll never go any further. First and foremost is Dundas Aqueduct itself. By it, John Rennie took the canal directly across the valley to the Wiltshire side. Named after Charles Dundas, the first chairman of the Kennet and Avon Canal Company during its building and successful early years, the solid bulk of this massive 3-arched bridge is sharpened by its classical ornamentation, Doric columns, stone balustrades, and an enormous overhanging cornice. Dundas Wharf is a microcosm of the features that would have been common on any small canal wharf throughout the country. Here we have a warehouse building, a wonderful iron hand-operated crane, large stone blocks used for weighing boats, and tucked away up in a corner, the little toll house. In this building were collected tolls from 2 canals, for here, at the far end of the wharf, is the junction with the Somerset Coal Canal. Probably this was the most important place on the whole Kennet and Avon from a commercial point of view, for from this small entrance emerged an immense amount of coal from the Somerset coalfield. Carried entirely on narrowboats, Somerset coal was the main traffic on the Kennet and Avon and on a network of interconnecting canals across southern England. Like its big sister, the Somerset Coal Canal was overpowered by the GWR, Great Western Railway, but unlike the Kennet and Avon, it suffered the indignity of being turned into a railway. Much of the Somerset Coal Canal survives, however, in a romantically derelict state, and at Dundas the first quarter of a mile or so has been restored as a much-needed boat business and moorings. But now we cross the aqueduct into Wiltshire and start on one of the most magical stretches of the whole canal. In 1887, a canal traveller passed this way, and he wrote, "This aqueduct carried us across the valley to the slopes of Caen Hill, in fact, and very soon we had left the wide open country behind us and were plunged into umbrageous woods. It was much hotter here. There was hardly a breath of air to stir the shelving branches that felt their way out into the sunlight." And so the canal now threads its way along the wooded eastern side of the valley. It's still going south, remember. Looking back, we can see the line of the Somerset Coal Canal with its moored boats briefly parallel to the Kennet and Avon before it turns away westwards up the Monkton Combe Valley. At Limpley Stoke Bridge, the infamous dry section is reached. Here, throughout its life, the canal suffered leakage due to faulty strata under the bed, and every year sections were drained to be repuddled with clay. However, between 1976 and 1978, the 1 3/4 miles between Limpley Stoke and Avoncliff was relined, nay, rebuilt in concrete and stone, through a job creation scheme funded by British Waterways, Wiltshire County Council and the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust. The woods give way to fields as Avoncliff is approached. Here, the second of John Rennie's major aqueducts takes the Kennet and Avon back across the railway and river, almost as if, having tried the other bank for a while, the canal seems to have preferred staying on the side of the valley on which it left Bath. Avoncliff Aqueduct does not have the same classical grandeur as Dundas, but it is bulkier, more domestic in its appearance. The hamlet of Avoncliff has enough left of its past to set the imagination racing. 2 mills, one converted, the other ruined with its enormous wheel still in situ, stand on the weir, and they are the clue to the history of this intriguing little place. The row of cottages is dominated by the Cross Guns, a very popular canal-side pub, beside which is a little bookshop specialising in canal books. Avoncliff still has its railway station, providing the second best means of reaching this strangely remote spot. The best way is of course by canal. Now there's only a mile and a half left before the lock at Bradford on Avon. On this stretch is a swing bridge with a difference. It's modern and mechanised, but only up to a point. It has to be wound up to lift it free, but then it is pushed open just like the original bridges. Now, as the Kennet and Avon approaches Bradford on Avon, stands one of the most ancient buildings beside the entire canal, the magnificent Tithe Barn. Built in the 14th century, it is one of the largest in the country. Today it houses a collection of agricultural implements, machinery and relics. Mooring beside the Tithe Barn, one is overshadowed by the enormous stone roof, weighing many tons. Here, at last, is the first lock since Bath, 9 miles back, and with a rise of just 10 feet, the Limpley Stoke Valley is left behind. Bradford on Avon, a little town in the valley, still reflects the prosperity of its wool trade, which predated the Industrial Revolution. As well as monuments such as a complete Saxon church, the ancient lock-up jail on the bridge, there are many handsome houses built by the cloth mill owners and managers. Several of the mills of Bradford survive, the one dominating the centre of the town still in industrial use by Avon Rubber. Back on the canal, the wharf above the lock is run by the local branch of the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust, who have restored the warehouse building with its adjoining dry dock. Just beyond the town is one of the new marinas with its handsome pub and restaurant, indicative of the interest and prosperity the canal has generated as a leisure attraction after the long years of neglect and dereliction. Still with the diminishing River Avon alongside, the canal skirts Trowbridge, the county town of Wiltshire, crossing as it does so another aqueduct over the River Biss, much smaller than its counterparts at Dundas and Avoncliff. On the edge of Trowbridge is the village of Hilperton, with its boat businesses, hire fleet, chandlery, moorings and a new marina. Now at last we have said farewell to the River Avon, and the canal continues by itself in open country, no longer tied to the contours of the valley. Soon after crossing a small aqueduct, the village of Semmington with its 2 locks is reached. The rather dull-looking piece of wall here is actually occupying the arch of the bridge across the entrance to the Wilts and Berks Canal. This canal ran 51 miles northeast through Melksham and Swindon to the Thames at Abingdon. Above the first of Semmington's locks is a splendid covered dry dock, probably the finest dock on the canal. As the canal climbs through Semmington Top Lock, the feeling of altitude begins to be apparent. The landscape is open and fairly flat, very different from the deep valley, now left far behind. Three swing bridges interrupt the next pound, but soon the flight of 5 locks at Seend Cleeve is arrived at. Climbing the flank of Caen Hill, these locks are in a delightful sylvan setting, proving perhaps the epitome of a rural English canal. What makes them even more perfect is that halfway up is a canal-side pub with a welcoming moorings beside the garden. Converted from what was an old boatman's alehouse, it takes a strong-minded boater, walker or any canal user to pass by without stopping. At the lock above the pub, evidence can be seen of the ironworks which dominated the scene here for about 30 years in the 19th century. Above the Seend flight, the canal is now at the level from which it makes the giant leap at Devizes, a few miles ahead. Strangely remote is the waterway here, frequent swing bridges giving evidence to the intensity of agricultural activity when the canal was built. At most of the bridges, both swing and up and over, were small wharves serving the local community. Rag's Wharf, near the village of Sells Green, was the destination of the last boat traffic in Somerset coal before that canal closed in 1898. Water entering the canal under the towpath is the Seend feeder. Fed from the Somerham Brook, this is the main, nay the only substantial natural water supply to the Kennet and Avon west of Devizes. At Lower Foxhangers Farm, the site of a new marina, is the first of the 29 locks which lift the canal 234 feet in 2.5 miles. Truly one of the wonders of the waterways. The flight of locks climbing up to the market town of Devizes starts with 6 reasonably spaced locks, but rising through lock number 28, we are presented with the Caen Hill flight, 16 closely spaced locks with large side ponds between them. This remarkable flight of locks was the last part of the Kennet and Avon to be completed in 1810, and by the 1820s traffic had grown to such an intensity that gas lighting was installed to facilitate all-night working. The large side ponds were constructed to store water so that it was not necessary to continually let water down from the top. At the top of the main flight of locks is the local headquarters of British Waterways. From the manager's office here, the whole canal is controlled, maintained and promoted. Emerging from the top lock, the canal now begins a lock-free section of 15 miles, the longest pound on the whole waterway. But, as we shall see, it is still not at its highest level. There are another 4 locks to go up before then. Devizes town, however, is still pretty high, 420 feet in fact. A busy and attractive market town, still with its own independent and flourishing brewery, Devizes was always an important trading destination, originally having 3 canal wharves. Only Town Wharf survives today, and the restored granary building is fittingly now the headquarters of the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust. Above the offices and well-stocked shop is a very fine canal museum, containing many records, pictures, artefacts and models. Past the wharf, and the canal seems to want quickly to rid itself of the town, diving into a cutting which promptly turns a right angle, heading briefly for the hills to the north. The new yet attractive Coat Bridge at the end of the cutting reveals a brief glimpse of the edge of Devizes, but then the town is gone and the canal begins its most rural length. Meandering on the 420-foot contour through the Vale of Pewsey, with the Marlborough Downs close at hand to the north and Salisbury Plain rising in the distance to the south, the canal seems almost to avoid contact with human beings. Villages are skirted, farms are at a distance. A feeling of remoteness is sensed which, in the middle of the clamour of southern England, is scarcely credible. There are no main roads, and even its old adversary, the Great Western Railway, deserts the canal for most of the Long Pound. With no locks and only a couple of swing bridges to interrupt navigation, a cruising boat can easily lose track of its position as villages, fields, hedges, bridges slide past in endless procession. Although not the actual Vale of White Horse, that's further to the north, at least 2 white horses can be seen to the north and south on the chalk downs. The one to the north was cut in 1812 on the slopes of Milk Hill, which is the highest spot in Wiltshire. At last, the hamlet of Honey Street appears, straddling the canal. Named after the north to south route of the prehistoric Ridgeway long-distance path, Honey Street was once a place of great importance to the canal. A clue to this is the strangely out-of-scale and dominating Barge Inn, a pub which originally provided many of the needs of the community, as it was both bakehouse and slaughterhouse, as well as the source of liquid sustenance. Honey Street is in fact entirely a product of the canal, springing up from nothing when the waterway was constructed. And here is the remains of the boatyard of Robbins, Lane and Pinniger, one of the last traders on the canal. Robbins also were prolific boat builders, and hard as it is to imagine now, from this wharf boats were launched sideways into the canal, not just narrow boats, but wide beam barges as big as the canal would take. Robbins eventually closed the business in the 1940s, and since then other activities have used the site with scant regard for the waterway that was its raison d'etre. Beyond the bridge, another wharf, now called the Old Builder's Wharf, also recalls the history of this unique place. The interruption of the rural scene by Honey Street is brief, and the emptiness returns immediately. A delightful surprise is in store with Ladies' Bridge, a sudden reminder in Bath stone of the classical designs of John Rennie, now left far to the west. ornate bridge leads immediately to a lake-like widening known as Wilcot Wide Water. Both Ladies Bridge and Wilcot Wide were the result of the owner of Wilcot Manor at the time, Lady Wroughton, insisting that if a nasty modern canal must cross her land, then it must at least improve the landscape rather than detract from it and defile it. The result was a success, beyond probably even her ladyship's imagination. Maintaining the remoteness of the canal, even the capital town of the Vale of Pewsey, ancient Saxon Pewsey itself, is a healthy half-mile from its canal wharf. Pewsey Wharf today is leased by the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust and is headquarters to a flourishing boat club. Hereabouts also is the geographical halfway point of the canal. Reading is now closer than Bristol. Beyond the tiny hamlet of New Mill, the Great Western Railway returns to try and convince the boater, who knows otherwise, of its superiority over the canal. From here to the canal's end at the Thames, the railway will never be far away. Almost as soon as the canal has been dragged back into the present day by the railway, the long pound comes to an end. The four delightfully situated locks at the village of Wooden Rivers raise the Kennet and Avon the final 30 feet to its 450-foot summit. From this level, the only way is down, and although it is a mere 3 miles before this process begins, there are still things of interest on this stretch. Burbage Wharf, for example, which was the wharf for the town of Marlborough, some miles to the north, contains a fine replica of its original massive timber crane. Within half a mile, the cutting deepens, until the low hill envelops the canal's only tunnel. 502 yards long, Bruce Tunnel is named after Thomas Bruce, Earl of Aylesbury, the local landowner, the family still is, who insisted that the tunnel should be built. There was no real engineering reason for it. As the canal was neatly out of the way, the rival railway companies sliced off the top of the hill 40 years later to build a large railway junction. Today, post-beaching, only the Great Western Railway main line survives, and this takes advantage of the third-of-a-mile canal bridge to cross over, which caused confusion to many travellers who, emerging from the tunnel, find the railway on the wrong side. Almost immediately, as if frightened by the rarefied atmosphere of its highest point, the canal starts to descend through the 7 locks of the Crofton flight. From now on, it's downhill all the way, and the whole eastern part of the navigation is dominated by locks. 6 locks down, and another of the Kennet and Avon's amazingly historic monuments is reached. Rather more grand than Claverton, but still humble in its own way, the brick building with its curiously truncated chimney houses the Crofton steam pumping engines. As the summit level was so short, it needed a constant supply of water to feed the ever-thirsty locks, and as there was no natural input at that height, the canal had to be fed artificially. John Rennie and another engineer, William Jessup, recommended the system of steam pumps which remain with us today. 2 magnificent 3-story steam engines lift water 40 feet to the summit level via a mile-long lead or feeder. Although one of the engines was replaced as recently as 1846, the other was installed in 1812 and is reputed to be the oldest steam engine still doing the job it was built for in the whole world. The magic of Crofton can only be appreciated by being beside the hissing, rumbling monsters as their massive beams rock majestically and heat from the furnaces permeates the whole building. 1836, more water than that provided by the spring-fed engine pound was needed, and the canal's only supply reservoir, Wilton Water, was formed by damming streams on the opposite side of the canal. Today, water is pumped electrically from Wilton Water, supplemented by the steam pumps at working weekends. The survival and restoration of this living museum is due entirely to the efforts of the Crofton Society, a branch of the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust. The villages of Great and Little Bedwin, with their dominant churches, sit astride the canal, which is now showing increasing signs of boat traffic. In Great Bedwin is the extraordinary Stone Museum, a little rural masonry business that seems at some stage in its existence to have been struck by a kind of madness, the resulting epitaphs and commemorative statues ranging from the curious to the bizarre. Just before Hungerford, the diminutive River Dun is crossed by a small brick aqueduct, the last such before Reading, and whilst far removed from the splendours of Dundas and Avoncliff in the west, it still has a charm of its own. The lock before Hungerford, Hungerford Marsh Lock, is distinguished by having a swing bridge right across the chamber, an indication of the importance of rights of way in the days when shankses and other ponies reigned supreme. Today the bridge remains as a reminder of the relatively recent intrusion of the canal into the landscape. The town of Hungerford, its wide street stretching up the hill to the south, has a powerful history, with ancient customs still alive and much common land dating back to its great benefactor, John of Gaunt. Once an important trading point on the canal, the navigation reached the town in 1798, activity on the waterway is continued from the town wharf today by 2 passenger trip boats, one operated by the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust and the other specifically built to take handicapped people. Beyond Hungerford, the River Dun has now joined with the Kennet, but still the canal is separate from and above its second river. At the village of Kintbury, however, 4 locks further down, the navigation is at last replenished by the flow from the Kennet, a river originating in the chalk hills of the Marlborough Downs. From here, for the rest of its journey to the Thames, the river and the canal weave in and out of each other like an enormous pigtail. Kintbury, an old and pretty village, is skirted by the canal, but below the lock, on the island formed by the river and canal, stands the Dundas Arms Hotel. Charles Dundas, the first pioneering and longest-serving chairman of the Canal Company, lived near Kintbury, hence the name of the pub. He himself declared open the first section of the navigation in 1797 from Newbury to Kintbury. Since leaving the summit at Crofton, the valley has gradually been opening out, and so it continues to do east of Kintbury, at least to the north. But to the south, the canal tucks itself close under the delightful slopes of Irish Hill. The countryside has now lost the downland livestock pasture dominance of the west for a more mixed arable feel, although sheep and cattle are still to be seen. Between regularly spaced and beautifully situated locks, the influence of the River Kennet is becoming greater, the river now occasionally joining with the artificial cut. It is now not a true canal any longer, being instead a navigabilized river. The navigation is divided into 3 distinct sections: pure river from Bristol to Bath, pure canal from Bath to Kintbury, and now a combination of the two for the rest of the way to Reading. At Benham Broad is another example of the beautification of the waterway, at the insistence, as at Wilcot Wide, of the local landowner. Although here the landowner, Lord Craven, was also a promoter of the canal, so presumably did not have much difficulty in convincing the Canal Company of the necessity in creating this wide lake-like section. Several large estates hereabouts contribute to the well-kept, typically English appearance of the landscape. Soon the rooftops of the bustling town of Newbury are flowing over the hillsides, and the town is entered at West Mills Wharf, with its cottages, swing bridge and mill. The scene of the last attempt at long-distance commercial carrying on the canal in 1950 by John Nill and John Gould, both stalwarts in the long struggle to save and then to restore the Kennet and Avon. Newbury is another example of the green lung effect of a canal in a town. Although it passes through the town centre, under busy main roads, and past large industrial estates, it always carries with it the air of either solitude or greenness, and often a combination of the two. The town lock, which was the first to be built on the new canal in 1796, seems somehow more than 2 centuries away from the tumult of the busy street just below. The street crosses the navigation on a narrow bridge without a towing path, a situation which caused problems to horse-drawn boats, especially when coming upstream against the current. A long rope would be floated down from the lock in order to pull the boat through. Old red brick buildings echo the architecture of the main street, and the waterway is a magnet for wildlife and human life alike. The next bridge, both looking and being called temporary, being built during the Second World War by the Americans, is the lowest on the whole canal, headroom being reduced to 7 feet at times of flood, and not much more at normal times. One of the few structures remaining at what is left of Newbury Wharf, the stone building, is now the headquarters of the local branch of the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust. We have now joined an entirely older navigation, as, like its counterpart in the west, the River Avon, the River Kennet was made navigable from Reading to Newbury in the 1720s. Although for many years isolated by dereliction, the river and canal through Newbury has long been a popular boating stretch, and today contains well-occupied boatyards and mooring basins hidden in backwaters off the main channel. The green lung continues away from the town centre, as modern factories and warehouses barely penetrate the woods which surround the lock cuts and mill streams. East of Newbury, the valley is again becoming flatter, and the meanderings of the river are more emphasised by the sections of artificial cut, which are much straighter. Here, old osier beds and marshes are preserved as important ecological sites and are home to many rare species of birds and plants. The many watermills on the River Kennet dated back to time immemorial and caused considerable difficulty when navigation was created, but they were eventually successfully bypassed by lock cuts and continued operating and using the waterway in every sense. Today, however, they are all gone or converted for other uses. In some cases, such as Colthrop Mill, the site has evolved, but maintained its original use. A paper mill since 1805, it is now an enormous paper-making factory. Whilst to the west the operating mechanism of locks and swing bridges could scarcely have been said to be standard, they were at least similar. Here, down east, there is a positive riot of design, as the locks and bridges range from old to restored to rebuilt to brand new. They have been restored by a variety of bodies and organisations, namely British Waterways, the Kennet and Avon Canal Trust, a consortium of local authority job creation schemes, and private contractors. The The swing bridges are sometimes entirely manual, faithful copies of John Rennie's original ones. Sometimes needing to be raised manual hydraulically before swinging. Sometimes being raised electric hydraulically before swinging. Sometimes being raised and opened entirely automatically. Here at Aldermaston is the pièce de résistance, the magnificent, all-singing, all-dancing vertical lift bridge, which apart from the ex-Oxford Canal bridge across the entrance of the Somerset Coal Canal at Dundas, is the only lift, as opposed to swing, bridge on the canal. The reason for these substantial and obviously expensive bridges is that in the flat Kennet Valley, many of the crossings of the waterway are public roads, and of course the bridges have to be able to take modern traffic weights as well as opening to allow navigation. Lock construction on the Kennet is also greatly varied. Both history and modern restoration techniques have resulted in an extreme range of lock design. Originally, all the locks were turf-sided, a very ancient method of building chamber locks, and today two of these survive, at Monkey Marsh and Garston. Here at Garston, the chamber is masonry for the first couple of feet above the low water line, and then slopes back at 45 degrees. Boats are confined to the centre of the lock by a framework of old Great Western Railway lines. This is now the narrowest lock on the entire canal. Some locks have been rebuilt very handsomely with standard brick rectangular chambers. Two others have scalloped walls, following the line of the old foundations. Aldermaston Lock is a splendid example of a fine modern structure rising from the ashes, so to speak, of the past. At the other extreme of reconstruction is Ufton, where an old shallow lock was completely dispensed with and now only the chamber remains. Much of the Kennet Valley is rich in useful gravel, and whilst many gravel workings are now disused or transformed into wildlife reserves or recreational lakes, those which are still being worked only occasionally intrude onto the waterway which threads between them. Although the M4 motorway parallels the canal all the way from Bristol to Reading, it is, mercifully, always several miles to the north. Just once, however, here at Thiel, it swoops down from the north, flies over the waterway, and thunders off like a low-flying jet, never to be seen again. As the motorway crossing happens to be in a particularly sylvan part of the navigation, it is scarcely noticed, as the river tortuously swings round tight bends, each of which opens fresh new vistas of banks, trees and fields. Motorway? What motorway? And now, if one cares to look, Reading, Journey's End, can be seen in the distance. There are, however, still several miles to go of green quietness before the town envelops the waterway completely. Within those miles are the remains of two Victorian pumping stations which once provided the burgeoning town with its water. Although private gardens run down to the river, by the time County Lock is reached, there is no getting away from the fact that we are in a large town. This lock is officially the last one on the navigation, although there is one more, as we shall see. County Lock has a fall of only about 18 inches, hardly worth stopping for. Reading, a town to match Bristol in history and industry, famous for beer and biscuits, amongst other things, has 2 navigable rivers and has somewhat inevitably concentrated its attention on the other one, the Thames. However, the Kennet through the town has never been totally derelict as a navigation, and years of neglect to its surroundings are now being made good. For the final mile from County Lock, the boater cannot allow his attention to wander. Through the infamous brewery gut, current can be fierce, and the very misnamed High Bridge is on a blind right-angle bend. Incidentally, the brewery, first Simmons and then Courage's, is no longer standing. High Bridge is the end of British Waterways jurisdiction. It began at Hannam. Shops, offices and people crowd in on the river, and then ahead is what appears to be a Thames lock, with its smart grey gates and beams. Although still on the Kennet, Blake's Lock is actually a Thames lock, the only one controlled by the Thames authorities, not on the Thames itself. Above Blake's Lock, beside a busy boatyard, is a fascinating museum of the waterway and industrial heritage of the town. Blake's Lock is so typically Thames, an oasis of fastidiousness, clean, tidy, well-kept gardens, so the final few yards of the Kennet are undeniably a disappointment as it slides beneath railway bridges and beside a disappearing gasworks. But suddenly it is there. The water opens out, and almost surreptitiously the Kennet is no more. It has become, like an ugly duckling, the Royal River Thames. So there it is, the end. The end of 92 miles of one of the most intriguing stretches of waterway in the country. This film has given just a glimpse of what it has to offer. There is much, much more. But little of it would have been left had it not been for the sustained and Herculean efforts of the Canal and Avon Canal Trust to save and to restore, supported by the unstinting generosity of its benefactors. The Trust have been joined wholeheartedly by the canal's owners, British Waterways, and supported by the local authorities and many others. The result is a waterway to be enjoyed by everyone: boaters, walkers, cyclists, anglers, naturalists, able-bodied and handicapped alike. In the words of British Waterways, the Canal and Avon Canal is yours to enjoy.